The toddler reached for the billionaire right there in the living room. One tiny hand, one soft laugh, cutting through years of silence. Ethan didn't move. He couldn't. Why was a stranger's child acting like he knew this broken man? Ethan Whitford hadn't let anyone close since the funeral. Not his brother. Not the doctors. Not even God. The new maid came twice a week. Janelle Brooks, always polite, always gone before dark. And the child, he was never part of the arrangement. But when her sitter canceled, she had no choice. Micah sat quietly in the corner, watching everything. By their third visit, he started to explore. And during one cleaning, Ethan walked into the living room and saw the boy standing on the couch, laughing at him. Why did that moment feel like something had cracked open? Before we continue, please like, share, and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's dive back into the story. The room went silent the moment Ethan Whitford stepped in. His footsteps echoed against the polished floors. His tailored suit caught the afternoon light. His face, as always, was unreadable, like stone carved in grief. Margaret Sloan, the house manager, froze near the entryway. A maid paused mid-dusting. No one spoke when Ethan was in the room. No one dared. It had been 6 years since his wife's death, and 6 years since anyone had seen him smile. Janelle Brooks entered quietly through the side door, yellow gloves tucked into her cleaning bag. She held Micah close to her hip, his arms around her neck, his little face buried in her shoulder. She'd nearly canceled the job when her sitter bailed, but she needed the paycheck. Badly. "I'll just keep him close," she whispered under her breath. 1 hour, then we're gone. She tried to slip down the hallway unnoticed, but Micah turned his head. Ethan was standing across the living room. Micah stared at the man for a long, strange moment. Then, without a sound, he wiggled out of Janelle's arms. "Micah," she whispered, panicked. But he was already toddling away. Everyone froze as the little boy crossed the massive room, the sound of his tiny shoes tapping against the floor. He passed the velvet couches, the fireplace, the glass coffee table, until he reached Ethan. Then, without permission, without fear, Micah lifted his arms and climbed right into the billionaire's lap. Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. His arms stayed at his sides as the child settled into his chest like he belonged there. Micah looked up at him and smiled. And slowly, unbelievably, something shifted. Ethan's lips twitched. His jaw loosened. His eyes softened. Then, like watching ice melt, his mouth curved upward into a trembling, stunned, unmistakable smile. Not a smirk. Not a courtesy. A real smile. The kind he hadn't made in years. A gasp broke the silence. It came from Margaret, then another from a staff member behind the curtain. Even Ethan's own hand went to his mouth, as if he didn't believe what it was doing. Micah giggled. Ethan let out a breath, shaky and low. Janelle stood frozen, horror creeping up her spine. This was it. She was done. Fired. Who brings a toddler to a billionaire's estate? Who lets that toddler climb on the boss? I'm so sorry, she stammered. He's never done that before. But Ethan didn't respond. He just looked down at Micah, a man shattered by grief, being reassembled by the hands of a child. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Inside, no one dared speak. What had just happened? Why did Micah go to him, and what did that smile mean after all these years? 3 years ago, Ethan Whitford buried his wife on a gray October morning. The trees had just begun to turn, gold, orange, red. The world looked like it was on fire, but inside him, everything had gone cold. Her name was Eliza. She'd loved tulips in winter and jazz on vinyl. She used to dance barefoot in the kitchen. She was the only one who ever made him laugh out loud. She died in a car accident on the way to her final prenatal checkup. They lost the baby, too. Since then, Ethan had lived like a ghost in the house they built together. A home designed for a family that never arrived. The staff said he walked the halls at night, silent, sleepless, sometimes staring at old photographs until sunrise. They whispered about the nursery on the second floor, how it stayed locked, how no one dared ask why. He worked, he existed, but he did not feel. At therapy, he sat across from Dr. Lauren Pierce, arms folded, jaw tight. She was kind but firm, never pushing harder than he could handle. "Ethan," she said one afternoon, "you're not heartless. You're frozen. There's a difference." He didn't answer. She continued, "When the body experiences extreme trauma, it protects itself. Your silence, your numbness, it's your heart's way of surviving." Surviving, not living. He hadn't smiled since the funeral. He hadn't stepped into a church since the casket closed. Children, especially, made his throat close. Their laughter, their hands, their eyes. One time, Daniel, his younger brother, brought his 2-year-old over unannounced. Ethan hadn't even opened the front door. "Not now," he had said through the intercom. "Don't ever do that again." Daniel didn't try twice. The staff grew used to his silence. They tiptoed around him, never making eye contact unless required. Meals were left outside his study. Rooms were cleaned only when he was away. "Mr. Whitford doesn't feel anything anymore," someone whispered once. But even that wasn't true. He felt too much. It just stayed buried. Until today. Until the moment a stranger's little boy climbed into his lap, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Until a tiny hand reached for his chest and touched the part of him no one else could reach. He smiled, not out of joy, not even out of understanding, but because something in him had shifted, cracked, warmed. Micah didn't say a word. He didn't need to. And now, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about that moment. The feel of that small body curled against him. The weight, the heat, the stillness after the storm. He stood alone in the living room that night, staring at the sofa where it happened. He rubbed his face, shook his head. What was it about that child that melted 3 years of ice in just 3 seconds? Janelle Brooks moved through life like someone carrying something fragile. Not just dishes or laundry baskets, but her son, her time, her trust. She never expected to be a single mother at 29. Never expected to raise a child in a world that constantly asked her to choose between work and safety, between rent and peace. Micah was 3 years old, and already the world overwhelmed him. Too many voices. He shut down. Too much noise. He cried in silence. He hated bright lights and flinched when strangers got too close. Slow to warm, one specialist had said gently. Too soft, a distant aunt had muttered. But Janelle knew her son wasn't broken. He was just tender. And so she protected him with everything she had. She took jobs that let her be close. She never left him with anyone who didn't feel right, even if it meant losing work. She'd rather stretch spaghetti across 4 nights than leave Micah with someone who ignored his tears. She cleaned houses. She folded clothes that weren't hers, scrubbed tubs, sorted linen closets, swept silence into corners. And she kept her head down. Whitford Estate was just another job. Big house, cold floors, polite but distant staff. The kind of place that smelled like old money and forgotten joy. She never met the man who owned it. She didn't need to. Then, last Tuesday, her sitter canceled 15 minutes before her shift. Micah clung to her skirt as she stood at the front door of the estate, heart pounding. She'd already turned down 2 other jobs that week. Rent was coming. Groceries were low. "Just this once," she whispered, crouching to meet his eyes. "You stay quiet. Stay with me." No exploring, okay? He nodded, solemn and serious, one hand gripping his stuffed lion, the other in hers. She entered through the service entrance, holding her breath. No one stopped her. No one asked about the child. She sat up in the guest wing, bucket by her side, Micah tucked quietly in the corner with his coloring book. She cleaned fast, like she was racing guilt itself. But on their third visit, something shifted. She turned to grab the mop, and Micah was gone. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She found him seconds later in the living room, standing in front of him. The billionaire, Ethan Whitford. Real and terrifying and far too powerful. She didn't know what scared her more, that her son was in his lap, or that the man was smiling. Micah had never gone to anyone like that. Not neighbors, not church members, not even family friends he'd seen for months. She stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to speak or pray. So what made Micah walk straight to a man he'd never met, like his heart already knew him? Ethan had never held a child in his arms without breaking. He used to dream about it, back when Eliza was alive. Late-night talks about lullabies and rocking chairs and storybooks. A nursery painted in soft green. A crib he never assembled. And then it was all gone. He'd avoided children ever since. Dodged them at weddings. Left restaurants if one cried too loud. The ache was unbearable. But now, Micah was curled against his chest like he belonged there. And Ethan couldn't move. He glanced down. The boy's small hands were balled up in his shirt, face tucked into the hollow of his neck. The room was silent. Janelle stood frozen at the edge of the carpet, her mouth slightly open. Margaret Sloane peeked from behind the kitchen archway, wide-eyed. Even the housekeepers stopped pretending to clean. Everyone was watching the same impossible thing. Ethan Whitford, the untouchable billionaire, holding a child. And not just holding him, letting it happen. His hands hovered awkwardly, unsure where to go. He slowly began to lift Micah off his lap, gently easing him down. Micah whimpered. Then he clutched tighter. When Ethan tried again, the boy gave a soft cry, small but piercing. The kind that made the floor tilt. Ethan stopped. His arms tightened instinctively. Micah's body trembled, little shoulders shaking like leaves in the wind. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, something unfamiliar, something heavy. His throat tightened. A pressure built behind his eyes. Breathe, he told himself. Don't feel. Just breathe. But then Micah pulled back, just enough to look at him. Big dark eyes, round cheeks, small fingers reaching up toward Ethan's face. The boy pressed his palm to Ethan's cheek. Safe, Micah whispered. One word. Soft. Certain. Ethan blinked, stunned. His breath caught in his throat. The house suddenly felt too quiet, too bright, too real. No one had called him that in years. Not strong. Not brilliant, not powerful. Safe. His jaw trembled. He didn't cry. Not fully. But something in him cracked, just enough for light to leak through. Micah smiled and leaned in again, resting his head beneath Ethan's chin. Ethan closed his eyes. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel empty. He felt human. Margaret slowly stepped back, disappearing into the hallway. Janelle didn't move. She watched her son, the shy little boy who feared everyone, choose a man who didn't even know how to receive love anymore. This wasn't normal. This wasn't explainable. And as Ethan sat there, still clutching the child, he felt a question rising inside him, quiet, trembling, and undeniable. Why does this boy feel safe with me when I've done everything to keep the world away? Ethan told himself it was just curiosity. That's why, every morning, he found himself glancing at the side entrance, the one where the maid came in, the one where the little boy sometimes followed her. At first, Micah's presence had felt like a shock to the system. Now it felt like oxygen. The staff began to notice. Margaret raised an eyebrow when she caught Ethan lingering near the staircase instead of locking himself in his study. He brushed past her. "Is the maid on schedule today?" he asked casually. She blinked. "Yes, sir." Ethan nodded like it didn't matter. But when Janelle arrived, Micah holding tightly to her hand, Ethan was already in the hallway. Their eyes met. A pause. A silent question. Was this okay? Micah didn't wait for an answer. He let go of his mother's hand and toddled straight toward the man in the suit, laughing. Laughing. It was the kind of sound that filled corners Ethan had forgotten existed. Later that week, he found Janelle dusting the bookshelf and surprised himself by speaking. "What kind of snacks does Micah like?" She turned, startled. "Oh, he loves anything with bananas and peanut butter." Ethan nodded. 2 days later, the kitchen was stocked with banana muffins and tiny jars of organic peanut butter. The same day, he asked about Micah's favorite toy. "Trucks," Janelle said, "especially red ones. He loves pretending they talk." That evening, Ethan sat in his office, staring at a computer screen, debating whether it was absurd to order a plastic toy truck. He had closed million-dollar deals with less hesitation, but he clicked by now. The next morning, the truck sat waiting on the windowsill. Micah's face lit up when he saw it. He raced toward the toy, hands outstretched. The joy in his laugh hit Ethan like sunlight through stained glass. The boy turned, holding up the truck like a trophy. "Thank you," he chirped, then zoomed off across the room, making engine noises. Ethan looked down at his own hands, stunned by the warmth in his chest. Not guilt, not grief, something else. Hope. Micah laughed harder that day than he had in weeks. He played until he was breathless, collapsed in a giggling heap beside Ethan, toy truck tucked under one arm. Janelle watched it all unfold from the edge of the room, arms crossed, unsure whether to smile or pray. Because whatever was happening, it wasn't normal. It was something sacred, quiet, healing. But miracles have enemies. And across the estate, behind closed doors, a voice whispered into a phone. Quiet, sharp, measured. "I don't care what it takes," the voice said. "That child doesn't belong here. Neither does she." Someone had seen enough, and they were ready to tear the whole thing apart. The warmth didn't last. Janelle noticed it first, how Margaret Sloane's tone shifted, how the polite smiles turned tight, how the once casual glances became quiet observations. Something had changed. She was finishing the morning vacuuming when Margaret approached, arms crossed, face unreadable. "May I speak with you privately?" Janelle straightened, her heart immediately picking up speed. Of course. They stepped into the butler's pantry. The door clicked softly behind them. "I've submitted a formal concern," Margaret said, without preamble. "Your son's presence has become a distraction to Mr. Whitford." Janelle's stomach dropped. "A distraction," she echoed. "He's engaging emotionally, smiling, interrupting his routines. That is not your role here, nor his." Janelle blinked fast. "He's just a child. He's never caused trouble." "I'm not questioning your competence," Margaret interrupted. "But this household runs on structure, professional boundaries, and your situation crosses lines." Tears stung Janelle's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "If you want me to leave." "I didn't say that. Yet." Janelle swallowed hard and nodded, and left the pantry with her heart in pieces. She found Micah in the foyer, hugging his truck tight. She didn't have the heart to tell him what had just happened, but someone else had overheard. Ethan. He had paused near the hallway during the conversation, out of sight, not by intention, but once he heard Janelle's name, he couldn't stop listening. By the time she returned to cleaning, Ethan was in Margaret's office. "You reported Janelle?" he asked sharply. Margaret didn't flinch. I did. For emotional overreach. It's inappropriate. Inappropriate, he cut in. That boy made me feel something for the first time in years. He didn't raise his voice, but the force of his words silenced the room. I see now why this house feels like a tomb, he added quietly. It's not the ghosts. It's us. Margaret's expression shifted, shocked but unreadable. I was only trying to protect you, sir. I don't need protection from a 3-year-old. The words echoed in his own ears, because suddenly he wasn't so sure. Later that evening, the warmth that had filled him all week twisted into something darker. Fear, Micah's smile, Janelle's kindness, the way they were breaking through his walls so easily. It terrified him. What if he failed them? What if he let them get close, and they left like Eliza did? By sunset, he had closed himself in his study, locked the door. When Janelle knocked gently an hour later, there was no answer. So she took Micah home early, or she thought she did. But when she turned to grab her bag, Micah was gone. Gone. Not in the kitchen. Not in the hallway. Not even by the door. Panic seized her chest. She raced from room to room, calling his name. Micah. No answer. Just echoes. Somewhere inside that massive mansion, her little boy had vanished. But where had he gone? And why did it feel like something was about to break? They found Micah by candlelight. The mansion's power had flickered during the storm, just enough to leave shadows stretching long across the floors. Janelle had searched every room twice before her steps led her to a hallway she hadn't entered before. The door at the end was slightly open. Warm light spilled out. Her breath caught when she saw the plaque beside the door. Eliza's studio. No one had mentioned this room. No one ever cleaned it. She stepped inside slowly. The walls were lined with framed canvases, watercolor florals, laughing children, still life bowls of fruit, and one unfinished piece that still sat on an easel, untouched by time. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and roses. And there, in the center of the room, was Micah. He sat cross-legged on the floor in front of a large portrait of a woman with soft eyes and auburn curls. Eliza. His toy truck was beside him, forgotten. He was staring at the painting as if in conversation. Micah, Janelle whispered, kneeling beside him, breathless with relief. What are you doing in here, baby? He looked up at her, then turned his eyes back to the portrait. She said he's not alone, he said softly, his small hand resting gently on the woman's painted face. She told me to come here. Janelle's blood ran cold. Who told you that, sweetie? Micah didn't answer. Footsteps echoed behind them. Ethan stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, eyes wide, chest rising and falling too fast. He saw the portrait, then the boy, then Janelle. He stepped inside. Micah, he breathed. Micah turned to him and smiled calm, like he'd been waiting. He stood, walked to Ethan, and reached up. She said, "You're not alone," Micah repeated. Ethan sank to his knees. The weight of 3 years crushed him in a single breath. His shoulders shook. His mouth opened, but no words came. Tears spilled freely, grief, love, loss, and something else. Relief. He wept, not like a man ashamed, but like a man finally set free. And Micah wrapped his tiny arms around his neck and held him, firm and still, like only a child can. Ethan let go. He wrapped his arms around the boy and pulled him close. Janelle stood quietly, tears in her own eyes, not daring to interrupt whatever was happening between them. Whatever had been spoken beyond sound. Whatever had been healed without words. For a long moment, nothing else existed. Only the broken man, the little boy, and the memory of a woman who had once filled the house with light. What happened in that studio would ripple through their lives, and what came next would change everything forever. The next morning, the mansion felt different. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt expectant, like the walls were holding their breath. Janelle walked in quietly, Micah's hand tucked in hers. She didn't know if Ethan would be there, if he would act like nothing happened, or everything did. She didn't have to wait long. Ethan stepped into the room just as they were removing their coats. His face was open, softer somehow, like the man beneath the grief had finally surfaced. "Janelle," he said, voice low, "would you sit with me?" She hesitated, unsure, but she nodded. They walked to the sunroom, Eliza's favorite place, and sat across from each other as light filtered through the tall windows. Micah plopped down on a nearby rug, already playing with the toy truck Ethan had bought him. Ethan stared at his hands for a long time before he spoke. "I owe you an apology," he said. Janelle stayed quiet. "For pushing you away," he continued. "For being afraid. For letting pain do all the talking." His voice trembled. "When I lost Eliza and the baby, I thought I died with them. I stopped believing that anything good could reach me again." He paused, glancing toward Micah. "But that boy—" He swallowed hard. He didn't knock. He just walked right in. Micah looked up and crawled into Ethan's lap like it was second nature. Ethan's arms instinctively wrapped around him. Micah leaned against his chest, looked up, and said softly, "I choose you." 3 words. 3 decades of ice cracked in an instant. Ethan didn't fight the tears this time. He let them fall. Quiet, holy tears that didn't burn. They healed. His body shook, but his spirit felt steady for the first time in years. And in that stillness, something else stirred. Something deeper. A warmth filled the room. Not sunlight, not fire. Presence. Not loud, not dramatic. Just there. Ethan closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he prayed. Not with words, with surrender. It felt like someone had placed a hand on his shoulder, like he was no longer carrying the weight alone. "I thought I was invisible to God," he whispered, "but maybe I just stopped looking." Micah snuggled closer. Janelle wiped a tear from her cheek and smiled through the ache in her chest. She saw it now, clear as day. This wasn't random. This bond, this healing, this moment. It was written long before any of them knew. Micah wasn't afraid because his spirit recognized something pure. And Ethan wasn't broken anymore. Just broken open. But now that his heart was awake, what would Ethan choose to do with it? The announcement came quietly. No press release. No dramatic speech. Just a morning meeting in the sunroom where the new Ethan, fully awake, fully present, stood across from Janelle with a paper in his hand and hope in his eyes. "I'd like to offer you a new position," he said, effective immediately. Janelle blinked. "A position?" He nodded. "Head of family and child wellness. It's a role I created this morning. One this house has never needed, until now." Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm not a therapist," she whispered. "You're something better," Ethan said. "You're trusted. By Micah. And now by me." She glanced down at her son, who was building towers with couch pillows. "There's more," Ethan added. "There's a cottage on the east side of the property. It's been empty for years. I want you and Micah to live there. Safely, comfortably." Janelle covered her mouth with her hand. "Ethan, It's not charity," he said gently. "It's legacy." He paused. "It's family." Micah looked up from the floor and toddled over to Ethan's side, truck in hand. He reached up, and Ethan lifted him without hesitation. Janelle watched, heart full, as her son leaned close and whispered, "Thank you, Daddy Ethan." Ethan froze. Then slowly, the moment sank in. A full, unguarded, joyful smile spread across his face, the kind that lifted his whole being, not just his lips, not broken, not surviving, alive. Micah giggled and tucked his head under Ethan's chin. Janelle couldn't hold back her tears. But this time, they didn't sting. They healed. Outside, winter was beginning to lift. The trees swayed in soft wind. Somewhere, birds had begun to return. The house, once cold and silent, now echoed with life again. In the weeks that followed, routines shifted. Ethan made time for tea in the garden with Janelle. He attended Micah's preschool orientation. Staff who once whispered now smiled, amazed by the man they barely recognized. No one called him stone-faced anymore. One evening, as the sun set over the estate, Ethan stood at the nursery window. The same room he hadn't touched in 3 years. Now it held a rocking chair, a basket of toys, and the sound of laughter from down the hall. He smiled to himself and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't say to whom. He didn't need to, because whatever power had brought Micah into his life hadn't just restored what he lost. It had revealed something he didn't know he needed. Not just healing, redemption. And as he stepped out into the hallway, his hallway, he heard tiny footsteps racing toward him. Micah. Always Micah. Ethan knelt, arms open wide. And for the first time in a long, long time, he was ready. Because sometimes, it's not the life you build that saves you. It's the love that finds you when you least expect it.